Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when and where you are. Welcome to another Festival in a Box 3.0 tasting session. This session is for the Nikka Taketsuru, and I'm delighted to say we have the eminently professorial and amazing Nathan Shearer, the whiskey specialist from Speciality Brands, on with us again today. So I'm just going to bring Nathan in. Good
Hello.
morning, sir.
Good morning. Was it morning, afternoon?
Oh, well, actually,
watching it.
well, it's afternoon somewhere, and evening somewhere else.
Exactly.
But it is morning here in the UK. How are we finding you today? Are you well?
Very well. Just had my booster, so that midnight
Yes.
text I sent you last night about rescheduling. It's all fine. Bit of a scare,
Yes.
but other than that, enjoying being crazy busy for Christmas at the moment.
Yeah.
Just getting the good word of whiskey.
Absolutely, and spreading the good word. Obviously we're here to talk about the Nikka Taketsuru, but if you could maybe just introduce yourself to the viewers at home, some of whom may not know who you are and what you do, that would be great, and let us know how you got to be doing what you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. So for anyone that I've not met or anyone that's kind of new to this kind of whiskey festival in the box thing, my name is Nathan, and I look after the whiskey portfolio for a company called Speciality Brands. If you've never heard of Speciality Brands, that's nothing wrong with that. We work as a distributor, and we sell to wholesalers, retailers, and we essentially bring in lots of really amazing, premium, interesting spirits into the UK, from agaves to cognacs to cocky vermouth Americano, and then we've also got an amazing whiskey portfolio and an amazing rum portfolio too. So I look after Nikka, Kavalan, Amrut, Michter's, Portskeg, elements of Islay, single malts of Scotland. There's always one or two that I miss out and I feel really guilty, but a wide-ranging whiskey portfolio. So I've been working with SBL now for about 4 years. And before that, I was working in all the cocktail bars around London, bars called Swift, Calais, London Cocktail Club, and always kind of gravitating a lot more towards whiskey. So when the opportunity came to come aboard with Speciality Brands full time, I kind of jumped at the opportunity, and now I spend all of my life with a rucksack full of delicious bottles of whiskey, just running around the country doing tastings and having fun.
Has that only been 4 years?
Feels like a lot longer, right?
Feels like forever. I mean, in a good way, obviously.
But there was always, before I was at SBL, I was also helping out Steph. But I met you for the first time at the Whiskey Lounge back in London in 2015 or something like that. So I always kind of helped out with some of the shows, just to, it was a bit of extra pocket money, but also to really, dive into the portfolio and not have to pay for the whiskeys to sample them, which was always fun.
Yeah. I think you're a classic example of an enthusiast who worked in the on trade, who then has converted into being a whiskey specialist or brand ambassador or jack of all trades, as it would seem. And I think it gives hope to everyone who has a passion for whiskey that they can get into the industry, if they have the right set of skills and the passion for it. But that's the main thing, is the fact I know how much you love whiskey.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the whiskey industry is super welcoming to everyone. If you like whiskey, you're going to get on with a room full of people. And if you're that passionate about it, there's always going to be someone that's going to give you a chance. So it's, whether it's at the whiskey shows or whether it be, even just going and chatting to someone like Colin Dunn at a Milroy's tasting, you could end up starting something there. And then 5 years later, you're like, oh, I'm the one doing the whiskey tasting. And it's happened, you've got mates that it's happened to, I've got mates that it's happened to, and it's not that rare. If you like whiskey, you're passionate about it, people will always ask you to talk about whiskey.
Yeah, and it's very much worth talking about. Okay, so tell us about so we're gonna taste the Taketsuru bottling from Nikka. So I'm gonna pour myself just a small one, given it's the morning.
I'm kind of fresh at the back of a tasting last night, so I've got all my tasting notes still in the back.
Fantastic.
No, it's fantastic.
I tell you what, let's go through the tasting of the whiskey first, and then if you can maybe give us a bit of background to the bottling and the brand.
Yeah, absolutely.
After that, so I'll bring up a little image of the bottling, and people can also see where they can get it from. So what should we be finding flavor wise, aroma wise in the Taketsuru?
So I was kind of thinking, when we dive into Nikka, it doesn't matter what range or what kind of product you're talking about, there's always an element of that kind of traditional old school Scotch in there. And when I'm talking about brands like Springbank and Clynelish, there's that sort of waxiness that's always underneath, and there's just really old style of whiskey, and that's just because of the way that Nikka produce. They learned to make whiskey from the Scots 100 years ago, and they haven't really changed that method, whereas Scotland has evolved a little bit, become a bit more efficient. Taketsuru and the Nikka distilleries, they kind of focus very much on that traditional style. So we'll get into kind of the makeup of what Taketsuru is, but on the nose, you should be finding beautiful kind of citrus notes, really nice kind of smoky, barbecue, briny, oily, seaside notes as well, that beautiful maritime flavor. But then there's always this light, fruity, delicate note that runs through because of the second distillery called Miyagi-Kyo that's in there. So you should get honey, fresh fruits, lots and lots of lemon, lots of citrus. And I always think with Japanese whiskeys, you should always find peat in there as well, because at Nikka's distilleries, they use peat at both. But peat is much more of kind of a seasoning or an ingredient than the main event in Nikka. So when we talk about a lot of the Islay whiskeys, and this is no disrespect to them, I love Islay whiskeys, but peat is sometimes that is the flavor of the whiskey. You have that smoke, and then there's other things that you have to really dig down. In the Taketsuru, the smoke is used as an ingredient to kind of tie a lot of the lighter, fruitier, citrusy flavors together. So you end up with a really well-balanced, really, really textured and rich, fruity, but also malt-driven dram.
It's definitely a good breakfast whiskey. I can...
Totally. Yeah, there's almost kind of like a creaminess to it as well. So if you're looking at, oranges, yogurt, granola, those sorts of flavors, just with like a hint of slightly charred eggs, not eggs, but slightly charred something in the background as well. If you're looking at breakfast.
Now, obviously, coming from a sort of bar background, you're not averse to the old whiskey cocktail. What's your thoughts in terms of the Taketsuru and, well, first of all, adding water to it, which would not necessarily constitute a cocktail, but does it react well to water? Would you recommend it?
100%. And I think the main thing that I learned from working in cocktail bars is that when someone, or any bar really, when someone's ordered that whiskey, however they want to drink it, that's the way you have to serve it to them. So if people want to put whiskey and Coca-Cola together, great, if that's how they enjoy it. But I think with Japanese whiskey, because of the way that they're constructed, they take really well to water, to dilution, and to mixing. When we talk about, we don't really see single casks of Japanese whiskey anymore. Every single product that Nikka bring to market now, whether it be the Oichi, the Miyagi-Kyo, the Taketsuru, the Nikka Days, they're a blend of lots and lots of different styles of whiskey, hundreds of different casks. And so if you're going to blend all these things together, then you can also add other flavors by using cocktails, So a Taketsuru Old Fashioned is absolutely beautiful. I think if you start with a good whiskey and you mix it well into a nice cocktail, the cocktail can only get better. If you start with something really subpar, then, it's not going to be a good cocktail. But if you start with something of high quality, if you went to a bar in York or in London or in Edinburgh or in Glasgow and you saw this on the back bar, I'd say in most places you'd be paying 12 to 15 pounds for an old fashioned with the Taketsuru. You'd probably pay £9 for a house pour. So it's a really nice way to get into Japanese whiskey, and mixing it with water as well. It's the way the Japanese drank whiskey for a really long time. Whiskey and water in the Mizuwari, or whiskey and soda in the Highball. And I've been trying to get everyone in the UK to drink highballs for the last sort of 5 years. It's been a mess, and we're slowly getting there.
I think you definitely are. I was at a certain brand's whiskey experience in Edinburgh a couple of weekends ago, and the highball, as obviously we've kind of adopted it in the West, was a big part of the presentation, and the new way to drink whiskey.
Ali Reynolds involved in it by any chance? Somewhere in Princes Street, maybe.
Maybe.
But they've been flying the flags for a long time as well. And you had people like Fraser Campbell over at Dewars who've been like instrumental in bringing the highball over. And myself and my colleague Steph, who've been working on Nikka for a long time, this was the preferred way to drink whiskey in Japan for a really long time. And when people try it, they're like, oh, okay, well, this is delicious. It's slightly fizzier, slightly more, maybe not more aromatic, but it has a lot of those subtler flavors in there. And it's just a really refreshing way of drinking it. I think in the UK, we're moving on a bit now, but I think for a long time, whiskey was slippers, armchair, dressing gown, pipe, smoky, and that was your thing. That was how you drank whiskey. God forbid you added water to it, or God forbid you put an ice cube in it. I think we're just moving a bit past that now. And with all the different styles of whiskey coming out, it's just a really nice way to explore.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think I was discussing this with someone the other day, and the Mizawari or Highball very much appears to be whiskey's gin and tonic moment. And if people start to accept that, and start to accept that actually you don't have to drink whiskey in a very prescriptive way as you've described, then that's all to the good.
I think whiskey is one of the most diverse, or if not the most diverse spirits. So there's some whiskeys that suit really well with a ginger ale. There's some that suit really well to be sipped neat. Because you have that really wide variety from all over the world now, you can kind of mix it however you want. And there's always going to be a whiskey that, even if someone says to me, I don't like whiskey, I'm like, challenge accepted. Let's find a whiskey you do like, because there will be one that exists.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, we'll probably go back to discussing current trends and things. But let's if you can tell us a little bit more about the Taketsuru bottling, but also the story of Taketsuru himself, because obviously the bottling takes its name from the founder of Nikka, and his story never gets boring, to be honest. So let's go for it.
Totally agree. And the interesting thing about the Taketsuru story is that every 6 months we'll find a new fact or a new little juicy bit of information that we can then add into the tasting. But yeah, I mean, really briefly, we could spend 10 hours just talking about the subtle history of Japanese whiskey. But the easiest way to kind of think about it is that the Japanese didn't make whiskey. The Japanese had their indigenous beverages, which were things like sake, shochus, awamoris, and they were predominantly made from the staple diet of the people, which was rice. The reason that we made whiskey and beer is because the staple diet was grain. So we figured out how to turn those grains into alcohol. The Japanese did the same thing. But barley, even though there was barley in Japan, it wasn't used very often for alcohol production. You do have some shochus and things that were made from barley and sweet potato, but rice was the main thing. So the Japanese wouldn't have figured out how to make whiskey if it wasn't for it coming over from America, from Scotland, from Ireland. But that came over a lot later than a lot of other places. In Japan, for nearly 300 years, you didn't really have much trade with the West. So there was no whiskeys, gins, rums, armagnacs, cognacs, all of this kind of thing. And then in the 1850s, we start to see Western goods kind of arriving in Japan. And obviously they were all the rage. Everyone wanted to try whiskey. Everyone wanted to try all of these things. And it became very expensive. So the Japanese tried to figure out how to make it themselves. And they didn't really know about that kind of the malting process or double distillation in pot stills or the maturation or anything like that. So Taketsuru was the person that actually went to Scotland to learn how to make whiskey. So from a family of sake makers, he studied at a technical college in Osaka, worked for a company called Setsu Shuzo, which at the time was quite a big alcohol producer. And they had the idea of building a distillery. And they sent Taketsuru to Scotland to learn all about whiskey production. So he studied at Glasgow University. He studied organic chemistry and learned all the kind of, the theoretical parts of whiskey distilling. The problem with just learning the theory, though, if you learn all of this kind of, the technical things that happen during fermentation and distillation, but if someone then just put you in a distillery, you'd be like, ooh, yeah, I don't really know what I'm doing here. So he worked at 3 different distilleries as well. So he worked at Longmorn, absolutely beautiful distillery up in Speyside. He worked at a distillery called James Calder in Bowness, which produced a huge amount of grain whiskey using a coffee still. That's why we still use the coffee stills at Nikka. And then over to Hazelburn, which, cult whiskey these days, beautiful Campbelltown style, West Coast, a bit more briny, a bit richer. And this is kind of where he learned how to make all the whiskeys. We've actually got and his notes that have just been released in English. So this is kind of, it's available on Amazon and loads of bookshops and stuff like that. This is basically a snapshot of how whiskey was made in Scotland 100 years ago. So he wrote all of this down, brought this knowledge back to Japan with a Scottish wife in tow. And then he was instrumental in setting up the Yamazaki distillery in 1923. Now, there's always a bit of a tough subject with Suntory versus Nikka because they're the two big brands. Taketsuru spent 10 years working at Suntory, but didn't really agree with Shinjiro Tori on the way the whiskey should be made and the location and things like that. So after 10 years, the contract was up and Taketsuru went all the way to the North Island to start his own whiskey company. So today, Nikka has 2 single malt distilleries and a grain distillery for whiskey production. They also have shochu distilleries, they make apple brandy, they make lots and lots of other styles of spirits and liqueurs. But for the whiskeys, there's 2 distilleries. One on Hokkaido, which is called Yoichi. And Yoichi produces very rich, very full-bodied, heavily peated, but also very maritime style whiskey. And they still use direct coal-fired stills at Yoichi as well. So something that no one in Scotland's really doing anymore. This is what I meant by it's a very traditional style of whiskey. So you get a very bold flavor. You get a little bit of this kind of toasted note coming from the Maillard reactions inside the stills. And it's just a really interesting style of whiskey that's kind of been lost around the rest of the world. To my knowledge, I mean, there might be a small distillery in someone's garage somewhere that's still using direct coal-fired stills, but no distillery of any scale is still using direct coal fire. So that was kind of Yoichi. That was the first distillery in 1934. And then 35 years later, Taketsuru opened another distillery called Miyagi-Kyo, which produced a lighter, fruitier style of single malt, more in line with the Longmorns of this world. So you had that more Campbelltown style up in Yoichi, then you had the more Speyside style in Miyagi-Kyo. And then in the 60s, they also brought over the coffee stills to produce the grain whiskey. And then this was kind of all 3 components he needed to create all of these blends. And we kind of forget that 100 years ago, no one drank single malts. These days, we only talk about single malts for the most part. So when Taketsuru learned to make the whiskey, it was all about blends. So he needed to create lots of different styles of whiskey in order to blend it. And this is kind of the interesting, or one of the more interesting parts of Japanese whiskey, is just the sheer volume of different styles of distillate they make. And if you were a blender in Scotland, say you were Mr. Johnny Walker, you could be in your office in Glasgow or Edinburgh, and you could call up 150 different distilleries, all with distinct flavors, and you could say, I want a cask from you, from you, from you, from you, from you, and from you. And that's your blend. In Japan, at this point, there's only 2 distilleries, and they're not really speaking to each other. So they couldn't just swap casks. They couldn't, use each other's distillates. So the key thing with Japanese whiskey is that each single malt, each distillery produces hundreds of different styles by varying yeast strains, by using peated or unpeated barley, changing fermentation times, changing distillation cut points. And then you've also got different still shapes and sizes as well. And then you've got all of the aging process. So there's just a huge amount of variance in that. So that's a very brief history of kind of Japanese whiskey. The Taketsuru, the one that it's in your glass now, hopefully, or in the bottle about to be in your glass. This is a pure malt. So we'd call this a blended malt, or it used to be called a vatted malt in Scotland. And this is a blend of Yoichi and Miyagi-Kyo. Now, Taketsuru, he passed away in 1979, 10 years after the Miyagi-Kyo distillery was founded. And he never really got to taste the older, richer styles of whiskey that he would have used for the blending before he passed away. But luckily, he had adopted his brother's son called Takeshi. And Takeshi had looked after his father and also helped him build the Miyagi-Kyo distillery. He was taking on the reins of the Nikka distilleries when his father passed away. So he decided he was going to bring out this whiskey in honor of his father, in the hope that this was the style of whiskey that his father was always striving to make. So for me, this has got that amazing history, but it's got that innovation between that very traditional style of distillery and the lighter, fruitier style at Miyagi-Kyo. It's a non-age statement whiskey. The vast majority of the whiskey in there is probably between 8 and 10 years, but there will be some slightly older and some slightly younger whiskey. And this is just a blend of Yoichi and Miyagi-Kyo. Predominantly Miyagi-Kyo, but with a healthy portion of Yoichi in there too, just to give us that richness and that balance. Miyagi-Kyo gives us the light, the fruity, the grassy, and the green flavors. And the Yoichi gives us that power, that depth, that slight smoky note, the black pepper, and all of that citrus. 43%, and just a great whiskey for every day. And I think familiarity is a key thing with this as well. If you're used to drinking Scotch and you went over to drink this, you wouldn't necessarily say straight away, oh, this is definitely a Japanese whiskey. You just go, this is a really great whiskey.
Indeed, indeed. There's lots of interesting things in there that I wanted to pick you up on. The fact that the Japanese and other world whiskey producers are allowed to use the term pure malt as opposed to blended malt, which is an advantage really, because I think a lot of people associate the word blended with blended Scotch whiskey, which obviously contains grain whiskey as well as malt whiskey, and is often wrongly seen as the inferior product. But that's the fact of the matter. It's the association with that. So it's quite important to note that pure malt simply means that it's a blend of malt whiskies. There's no grain whiskey present. And one of the other things was that you pick up on is the fact that Miyagi Kyo, and on the Suntory side of things, particularly Hakushu, their more recent malt distillery, they recognise the need for blending, and the fact that they're able to produce quite diverse styles of whiskey at these distilleries using different shapes and sizes of still, which is something I think the Scottish have now sort of pounced upon a little bit. So Diageo's experimental distillery at Leven is a classic example of experimenting with different shapes and sizes of still to achieve a different style of spirit. So I think it's quite interesting to see this kind of almost virtuous circle of influence between Scotch and Japanese whiskies.
It's exactly that. And there's a parallel in the wine world as well, isn't there, where it was all about France for such a long time, and then America was like, hey, we're making wine too. And then the irony was that American wine started to become really good, and the French went over to America to learn how to make wine and brought that knowledge back. And it's not that I think whiskey is such at its most basic, it's super simple. It's water, barley, and yeast that's turned into beer, boiled, collected, and put in a barrel. It's beer that's been cooked. And all of the different styles of whiskey, all over the world now are just, everyone's kind of got their little subtle thing that they do slightly differently. But now people are bringing those into different regions. We were talking about the guys at Penderyn the other day. You've got the guys at Kilchoman doing something slightly different and using, the floor maltings, which is something that's been not a lost art, but certainly something that people aren't doing very much anymore. So it's always, everyone's kind of borrowing from all over the world now. So it's a really interesting part of the industry at the moment.
Yeah, very much so. And just talking about so-called world whiskies, as we mentioned earlier on, what's your take on it? In terms of the term world whiskey, and obviously Japanese whiskey has kind of, to a degree, broken out of that world whiskey sector and is talked about as a separate category to certain degrees, but then you've got the likes of Welsh whiskey and English whiskey and so on, all being still lumped into this kind of world whiskies category. What's your take on it? Because obviously, as your everyday role at Speciality Brands, you're constantly talking about whiskies from all over the world.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because world whiskey encapsulates Irish and Scotch too, because we're talking about the world, so these are also subcategories of that world whiskey. So I think it's purely about education, I think, at this point. And I think the more whiskey lounges that people go to, the more online sessions that get offered, I think the categories become broader at a sort of smaller level. So Indian whiskey, which would have just been, for a long time, you had Amrit or you had nothing. So that would have just gone into a world whiskey. Whereas you go into some restaurants and some bars now, and there is an Indian whiskey list, or you've got the Japanese whiskey list, where it used to just be a bottle of Nikka from the barrel and maybe a bottle of Hibiki, so that was in the world whiskey, but now that's in Japan. So I see the trend is for more, more precise sort of labeling with that. But there's obviously going to be places like Israel, for example. To my knowledge, there's only one distillery in Israel at Milk and Honey, and they're not going to be able to break away from that world whiskey until there's a few more. So I think as these regions get bigger and bigger, it becomes that kind of, almost breaking off the shackles of that world whiskey title or world whiskey label, I guess. But I don't really see there's anything wrong with it. I think it's just the more education you have, it's similar in the wine world. I keep bringing wine back into this because I really like wine. But, for a while you had France, Spain, Italy, rest of the world. And you're there going, hang on, Georgia invented wine. Why do they not have their own category? Jordan make loads of wine. Why do they not have their own category?
Yeah.
But it's that kind of thing. And now you've got, single vineyard appellations in Sonoma County, over in California, which 10 years ago just didn't, it existed, but no one talked about it. So I think it's just slowly we'll break away from world whiskey, and we'll probably just call it whiskey. And then you'll just sort of look at where it's coming from.
Yeah, so like a natural evolution in the similar way that wine has moved from just being France, Italy, and the New World.
Exactly.
Like you say. Yeah. No, that's interesting, actually. I think, I get people's frustration, though, being lumped in with the, world whiskies, but, perhaps a more patient, pragmatic approach is necessary. Just have a dram, enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure, if you went down to, see Grant at Springbank or something, and if he was just Scotch, you'd be like, no, it's Campbelltown Scotch. It's not just Scotch. So how granular do you want to make it? Because obviously on Islay, they're very proud that it's Islay whiskey. It's, it is obviously Scottish, but it's Islay whiskey. And then if you go speak to Ardbeg, Lagavulin, and Lafroy, it's like, no, this is Kildalton Coast whiskey.
Yes, this is Southern Islay.
Yeah, and so I think there's always going to be that discussion. I think that's an amazing thing that people are so proud about where their whiskies come from, that we're having this discussion. Because if people were just like, it doesn't really matter where I make the whiskey, then there wouldn't be people that were actually annoyed at being called a world whiskey rather than an Irish or an Indian whiskey or a Taiwanese whiskey or a South African whiskey or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's just great that people are now embracing whiskey from wherever it may come from and judging it on its merits, on its flavor, rather than from where it's from. So that for me is perhaps the most important thing. But anyway, so in terms of outside of whiskey, I mean, you've mentioned wine, so that might be a hint to the answer to the next question. What's your favorite tipple? What will you be enjoying over Christmas apart from the obvious, whiskeys?
Apart from the whiskey, it's wine is a massive, I don't want to say passion because that makes it sound really pretentious, but my partner works in wine, so we have access to amazing wines from Burgundy and from all over the world, and so I love drinking wine. But I think if we were going to stick on spirits, which is always going to be my first love, Calvados for me. I absolutely love Calvados. I just think it's, we talk about all of these amazing developments in the whiskey industry and all this thing, and then you go to Normandy and there's just people that have just been that passionate for such a long time, just going, cider, distill the cider, age it for 20 years, and it's still like £40 a bottle. And you're going, I give you more money for this? But I think it's an interesting flavor. I think it's one of the few spirits that retains that brightness and freshness over decades of aging. If you look at cognac, it turns into something very not fruity after a while. You get the lovely leathery oaky flavors coming in, but I think you lose a bit of that brightness. With Calvados, I think you really retain what the DNA of that spirit is, which is the apples and the fruit and that really sharp flavor. Absolutely delicious.
Well, that reminds me, I need to get a bottle, so I'm going to ask for a recommendation once we finish with the recording. Well, maybe you could tell people, I don't know, is there something available in the UK worth trying?
Yeah, so we, just before the pandemic started, all of those years ago, many moons ago, we just brought in a new Calvados called Christian Drouin. Absolutely amazing producer, and it starts with, you got the eau de vie de cidre, which they call it, which is kind of like white Calvados, super light, super fresh. They've also got a gin, but then they go from sort of VSOP all the way up to Ordage, and then you've got all the vintages. So even if you only want to spend, £30-35 on a bottle, you can get that, they call it selection, which is absolutely incredible. And then if you did want to go for something a bit decadent, a bit more rich, you've got the vintages and you've got the Ordage. And it's always funny, like people go, oh, so how much would like a 1980s Bowmore cost now? You go, a couple of figures, that's probably, over £1,000. And then you look at another spirit category, Calvados especially, you're there going, it's 250. Yeah, cool. I'll go for that. It's a completely different price point, and you're tasting something with just as much history and quality in the production, but you've just got a much more approachable price point because it's just a smaller spirit. There's less people that know about it, but it's fantastic. I also like Somerset cider brandy too, just to keep it, UK based. You can always go.
Okay, well, listen, I think I'm definitely going to seek out this Calvados, but we should stick to whiskey for the time being. What was I going to ask you? I was going to ask you something else, Nathan. What was it? I was just going to quickly ask you in terms of the future for Nikka specifically. I mean, obviously we saw the age statements disappear, not just from Nikka, but from Suntory and all over the world really. But particularly with the demand and then shortage of aged maturing stock. Are we going to see age statements back at some point? Do you think, or do you know?
So I would, Nikka are always very, diplomatic when we talk about the age statements, because of course they would love to have age statements back. Those old bottlings were absolutely incredible, and everyone was, distraught when we had to get rid of them. But the most important thing for the brand is to have a consistent product that they can sell to help build the brand and build interest. So I think the idea is that at some point there will be age statements in the future. We are coming up to Nikka's 90th anniversary in 2 years now, or 2 and a bit years. So 2024. And so the current scheme of releases that they're going for is called the Discovery Series. So this is one of the bottles from this year. So this is an unpeated Yoichi. So very, very unusual style of whiskey. And over the next 2 years, there'll be 3 more releases, where the Discovery Series will be this kind of new and experimental style of Nikka, using some of the more weird and wonderful stuff. And then hopefully by the time we get to maybe the 100th anniversary in 12 years time, 13 years time, we might see age statements again. But it's just really difficult because a lot of people want the age statements, but you need to have really old stock to be able to do the older age statements. A 20-year-old whiskey, it's not just 20 years in a day. It starts at 20 and then might go up to 40, 50. Those old Nikka bottlings are a perfect example of that kind of over-aged spirit, because they had so much of it because no one was really drinking Japanese whiskey. Loads in the 70s and the 80s. The whiskey market crashed, and then you've just got a bunch of old stock sitting there that no one wants to buy. So you start putting it into the, Ben Nevis did a similar thing. Old Ardbegs, in the old before the Glenmorangie days, you had the 10-year-old that was mostly 17-year-old whiskey because they had stock of it. So age statements, I think, Nikka would be definitely trying to bring them back as soon as possible. Obviously, I don't know what the actual plans are. They're not secretive, but it's just on a very need-to-know basis at the moment. But I would say, the idea would be at some point to start having some age statements back in, just to differentiate the range up a little bit.
Yeah, but it's not going to be for a few years.
No, it's Having said that, you never know. Tomorrow there might be a 74-year-old Taketsuru that comes in. I very much doubt that will happen.
It's not that. Well, I do miss them to a degree, but the whiskies that they're producing are very, very fine. There's no doubting about that. But
if only we knew back in the day, when they were all available, and we were all just, this is delicious, and just keeping a few of them back just for moments like now, you'd be like, oh, that would be so nice.
Yeah, I mean, I don't go back as far as some, but I have to kind of blank out most of the 90s from my head because I just remember the prices. Oh my God! I wish I'd had some money.
You'd have a lot more money if you had money back then. Now.
Yeah, like certain other individuals that we won't mention. Good, right? Listen, Nathan, I've kept you for long enough. I really appreciate you coming on today. It's been a really fascinating chat as always. I hope the guys and gals at home have enjoyed it, and they have enjoyed the lovely Taketsuru that we've been tasting. But for now, I'm going to say Slanjavar or
Kanpai.
Kangpai. That's right. How could I forget? And have a great Christmas yourself. Hopefully I'll speak to you before, but if not, have a good one. And I hope everyone at home is safe and well and enjoying these sessions and their whiskies. So Nathan, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and Merry Christmas, everyone. Have a wonderful, wonderful time. And Eddie, I will see you very soon. It's whiskey show season just around the corner.
Exactly. We'll see you. We'll hopefully see you early in the new year. Cheers.
Cheers.